The Earth. From 60,000 miles away, it seems calm enough. A blue sphere turning peacefully in space. But travel thousands of miles closer, and recently you would have found a turbulent and terrifying place. Here in the atmosphere, hurricanes and tornadoes are spawned. Down below is the realm of volcanoes and earthquakes. From last Boxing Day until now, this has been the most disastrous year on record, with hundreds of billions of pounds of losses and more than 500,000 deaths. There have been 3 massive earthquakes. It's been the hottest year on record, and the stormiest. Scientists were amazed by the long count of catastrophes.
It's been an unusual year.
It looks like things are getting worse and worse.
It's been an incredible year.
People on every continent were affected in some way by the year's disasters. And with video and phone cameras, the devastation was captured by professionals and amateurs alike.
I was there on the day when the earth shook.
It's horrible to see home look like a war zone.
This is an act of nature.
For the last 12 months, the world's leading scientists and climatologists have tried to make sense of what happened. The big question is, was 2005 an unlucky year? Or are there fundamental changes in the way our planet behaves? Are this year's disasters a terrifying glimpse into the future? On Boxing Day 2004, around the Indian Ocean, the world was waking up. Off the coast of Sumatra, fishermen had been at work since dawn. On the beaches of Thailand, restaurant owners were opening up for the day. In Sri Lanka, a British tourist was beginning a holiday with her husband. Further down the coast, 1,500 people were starting a train journey. None of these people was aware that in the Earth's crust, tremendous forces were about to be unleashed that would change their lives forever. On the 26th of December, a massive earthquake ruptured the ocean floor 150 miles off the coast of Sumatra. It measured a massive 9.5 on the Richter scale, making it more powerful than all the world's earthquakes in the last 5 years put together. Closest to the epicenter was Banda Aceh on the island of Sumatra. Most earthquakes are over in a few seconds. This one lasted an incredible 9 minutes. All over the city, buildings collapsed. Thousands were killed instantly. But this was only the beginning. There was much worse to come. Under the sea, a deadly chain reaction was set in motion, and a giant wave, or tsunami, raced out from the earthquake epicenter at the speed of a jet airliner. First in line was Sumatra. A few miles off the coast, fishermen noticed an unusual swell, and familiar currents changed direction. Then the tsunami headed towards the coast, quickly building in size and power. In Banda Aceh, people were still in shock after the earthquake. Then came confused messages about the giant wave, and there was immediate panic. Minutes after the earthquake, the tsunami wave swept into the city, bringing with it a lethal cargo of debris. In just 15 minutes, the tsunami waves killed tens of thousands of people in Banda Aceh. Then it swept on. In Thailand on Boxing Day morning, beaches were stirring into life. No one was aware of the catastrophe in Banda Aceh, and no warning had been issued about the approaching tsunami. In seconds, 1,000 tons of water crashed down on every meter of beach. Then the tsunami raced inland, picking up debris and people as it went. Tom Travers and Richard Anthony own a restaurant in Kamala. They were having breakfast when they saw the tsunami racing towards them.
I probably went from about 300 metres out to the break wall here in less than a minute. And then came round sort of under the restaurant, took out the whole beach, went onto the road just a little bit, and then took out our lower deck.
The entire bay was just littered with umbrellas, beach chairs. For about 150, 200 meters out, everything was just cloudy. And I just thought, wow, something very serious has happened.
Here, grab it, quick.
When the wave receded, Tom and Richard assumed that the worst was over. They couldn't have been more wrong.
Coming again! Coming again! Big one. Back up! Oh my God!
Almost out of nowhere, it was like a class 4, class 5 rapids just started moving up, like freestanding waves coming right towards us with a bigger wall behind it. And that's when everyone just started screaming, like, run.
"45 minutes later, a third, even more powerful wave smashed onto the beach. These repeated onslaughts led to widespread confusion and panic. No one knew what would happen next.
Couldn't see the road. Half the temple was underwater, and just horrendous sounds of crunching and breaking and smashing. It was a really sick feeling, just knowing anybody that would have been on the ground level, gone. I mean, just swept away. Hopefully they floated to higher ground or something, but anybody who was in shops would have been in serious trouble.
Finally, the last wave retreated, sucking debris and people out to sea.
My God, I hope there's no people in there.
Huge disaster.
In Thailand on Boxing Day, 5,000 people from 57 countries were killed by the tsunami. 3,000 are still missing, presumed dead. The tsunami hadn't finished yet. At about the same time it hit Thailand, it swept in towards Sri Lanka. Still, no warning had been issued, and the tsunami, still travelling at 500 miles per hour, smashed into the southern city of Gal, causing massive destruction in minutes and killing thousands. The other side of Sri Lanka should have been more sheltered from the tsunami, but the waves twisted round the tip of the island and then headed straight for the coast south of Colombo. This is where Brenda Castle and her husband Jeff were staying at a holiday resort by the beach. That morning, Brenda was in the hotel basement talking to her tour rep when the wave hit.
There was this terrible noise. It was just like a roar. And there was this wall of black water coming down a staircase. You don't think anything because you haven't got a clue what it is. You can't think what it is.
At the same time, 3 floors above, Jeff was calmly videotaping the retreating wave.
We don't know what happened, but suddenly the ocean came up and we have a tidal wave. And what used to be our hotel is now a lake.
Jeff was blissfully unaware that in the hotel basement, his wife was fighting for her life.
Then there was that moment when I thought I was going to die. You just get on with thinking about how to stay above the water level and just keep doing that, really. Things were hitting me.
At the last moment, Brenda's tour rep suddenly reappeared.
And he climbed in and then held me up out of the water. Then said, "Don't worry, because I will get you out of here. I will get you out."
Ironically enough, sunshine-wise, it was the best day we'd had.
Brenda was lucky, but in Sri Lanka, many thousands of others were not. As she recovered at her hotel, the tsunami was about to cause the worst train disaster in history. The Queen of the South plies the picturesque route between Colombo and Gal, and the railway is never far from the sea. On Boxing Day, English tourist Shenth Ravindra was crammed among 1,500 other passengers.
I heard the water, and it just came like this. I didn't see a wave as such. It just sort of came like a flood. Then all of a sudden it came and started hitting the train, and it hit the train to such an extent that the carriage got detached from the other carriages that were behind us and in front of us, and shunted off the tracks. And then the water started to spill in, felt to come all the way up to my chin, and then I thought, right, I've got to get out of here. I was able to climb through this doorway and make my way onto the corner of the roof and the wall. There was a lot of chaos and pandemonium and worry and screaming. People were using any escape route that they could.
As the wave receded, all the passengers felt lucky to have survived and started to relax.
I didn't have a clue. I just thought it might have been a freak wave, a one-off.
Then the second wave hit.
All I could see was a wall of water that took up about 80 to 85% of the horizon, and the sky was blocked.
The second wave completely engulfed the train. But miraculously, Shenth's carriage stayed upright.
Luckily, it just pushed the carriage quite neatly along to the point where it wedged against the house.
Shenth jumped to safety, but most of the other passengers were not as fortunate.
And I could see like people still in the train that were obviously dead.
As the train disappeared beneath the water, 1,500 people were drowned. In Sri Lanka and India, more than 45,000 people died on Boxing Day. After Banda Aceh, this was the worst affected region of the Indian Ocean. 4 hours after the earthquake, the tsunami sped on, heading for the east coast of Africa. By now, international warnings had at last been issued, and in Kenya, authorities organized evacuations along the coast. As a result, there was just a single fatality. But many small fishing villages were destroyed. And in neighboring Somalia, where no warnings were issued, more than 200 died. In the next 24 hours, the tsunami rippled across all the oceans of the world. Coastlines had been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were dead. It seemed nature had done its worst, but the year had just begun. The Boxing Day tsunami was the worst natural disaster for 500 years. Scientists rushed to find out what had happened and why the wave had been so destructive. Phil Cummins of Geoscience Australia has been studying tsunamis in the Indian Ocean for more than a decade. He realized immediately that the culprit was a massive geological structure in the Earth's crust.
The Indo-Australian plate is what's called subducting beneath Indonesia. It's sliding beneath the plate that Indonesia is situated on. That interface has what's called stick-slip frictional properties, and that means it drags the upper plate down with it. And it pulls it down and deforms the upper plate, builds up strain energy. Eventually, the stress on that contact exceeds the strength of the contact, and the upper plate snaps back into position.
The earthquake was so powerful that the seafloor was kicked upwards by an amazing 65 feet, sending billions of tons of seawater surging to the ocean's surface. Then this huge column of water broke up into concentric rings, like giant ripples on a pond. This was the tsunami. Bill Maguire of University College London is a world-class expert on natural hazards. He studied one of the most lethal aspects of the tsunami, the way it produced multiple waves.
Well, when the seabed actually jolts upwards, it generates a dome of water, if you like, and that dome subsides into a series of waves. So you get what's called a tsunami train. And that means that when the first wave hits the shore, that people who think they've survived that and may go down to see what the aftermath is, may be faced by a second and third and fourth. And they're different sizes as well. So we don't know where the biggest and the most destructive is going to be within that wave train.
On Boxing Day, wave after wave had pounded Banda Aceh. The result, almost complete destruction. Streets and markets had been busy when the waves hit, and tens of thousands of people died in 20 minutes. Satellite images taken before and after the impact showed the extent of the devastation. Jeff Mackley is a cameraman who specializes in recording natural disasters. He's filmed the very worst nature can do. But he'd seen nothing to compare with the ruins of Banda Aceh.
This is chaos on an industrial scale. Just unbelievable. You know, all these buildings here and debris up the side of the hill for like 60 metres or about, you know, it's probably 100 feet up the hillside. It's just, it's beyond belief, really.
Even people who lived away from the coast were not safe from the killer wave. This man's house was a mile from the sea.
After earthquake, people see in the sea have water, wave.
And how big? How high?
Yang ketiga ya lebih tinggi. Yang kedua sama. Higher than coconut tree.
That's incredible. What was he thinking when he saw this wave?
Waktu kali denan kiban semiki. Panena demi fikir lom kan lari. They didn't thinking anything. They ran.
Scientists were stunned by the size and power of the tsunami. Oceanographer Simon Boxall set up a series of experiments to find out why it was so destructive.
As the wave approaches the land, the front of the wave slows down. It slows down to 400, 300, 200 miles an hour. The back of the wave is still going at 500 miles an hour. And the back of the wave catches up with the front. And you get this big build-up of water. Water is very heavy, and a cubic metre of water weighs a tonne. So if you've got one of your kitchen units at home full of water coming towards you or falling on top of you, that's a tonne of water. That's like having a car land on top of you. And as the tsunami progresses, as it goes through the coast, it's picking up stones, it's picking up debris, and that debris, cars, people being thrown at you, that's going to hurt, that's going to kill you.
Jeff Mackley recorded evidence of the tsunami's terrible power all along the Sumatran coast.
This is what's left of the Banda Aceh cement works and the wharf area. The ship being totally trashed there. Here we've got these huge big sections of breakwater, and they've just been sheared off and thrown over here like rag dolls. And these pieces here must weigh hundreds of tons, and it just defies belief, really.
Just this area we've been walking around here today is like the aftermath of an atomic bomb, is maybe worse.
The Boxing Day tsunami was one of the worst catastrophes in history. It killed nearly 500,000 people and destroyed entire cities. It led to mass starvation and epidemics. The tsunami's destructive power was magnified because it took everyone by surprise, including scientists.
In retrospect, the scientific community should have been aware these massive earthquakes do occur off Sumatra, and probably a little more emphasis should have been focused on the Indian Ocean, where it's documented that massive earthquakes occur.
The tsunami was a stark demonstration of the precariousness of our coexistence with nature. As the new year began, a stunned world struggled to recover. The Earth had struck with stunning ferocity. Now it would be watched very closely. In January, an eruption on Mount St. Helens, one of the most feared volcanoes in the world, led to a flurry of nervous reports. But this time, it was a false alarm. The volcano soon quietened down. Above the planet, satellites kept watch on the huge southern continent of Antarctica. At the beginning of February, something unusual was spotted. An iceberg the size of Norfolk had broken away from the vast Antarctic ice sheet. It joined a flotilla of other huge icebergs, all of them created in the last 5 years. The news shocked the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge. Here, scientists like David Vaughan use cores drilled from the ice to study the history of global climate. This record goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and now something very unusual was happening.
In the last 5 or 10 years, we've started to get enough satellite imagery and other data to see that there are parts of the Antarctic which are changing quite rapidly. So this giant that was sitting in the southern hemisphere, apparently asleep, seems to be starting to wake up.
It's extremely worrying to see these huge ice shelves. The Larsen B ice shelf that broke off a few years ago is about the size of Luxembourg. More of these things are breaking off, and as that happens, they're releasing the ice on land, which is sliding into the sea. Now that will raise sea levels considerably.
The news from Antarctica added to a global sense of unease. The world seemed to be changing, and at an alarming rate. At the beginning of March, Mount St. Helens roared into life again, spewing out a plume of ash and gas 6 miles into the atmosphere. This time, the scientists monitoring the huge volcano issued a high-level alert, and they had good reason. They hadn't forgotten how, in 1980, the giant volcano had collapsed in a spectacular eruption that lasted 9 hours. In North American cities hundreds of miles away, millions of tons of ash had fallen like black snow, blocking out the sun for days on end. In 2005, the explosive volcano was stirring again. It's not a matter of if, but when. At the end of the year, Mount St. Helens remains on high alert. March turned out to be an eventful month. On the 28th, without warning, the world's seismometers flickered into life. It was Sumatra again, and another powerful earthquake. Once more, a huge slab of ocean floor was jolted upwards, and billions of tons of water surged out from the epicenter, heading towards the Sumatran coast. This time, the outcome would be very different. As news of the earthquake flashed across the world, tsunami warnings were issued around the Indian Ocean. In Banda Aceh, thousands fled to higher ground inland. In Thailand, tourists were ordered to leave the beaches. Their anxiety was all too understandable.
The alarms along the beach here, they sounded off straight away and they were very loud. I live up on the hill and you could hear them from up there.
Thankfully, the much-feared second tsunami turned out to be a whimper, not a bang.
It was a big earthquake. It was more than magnitude 8, but because the magnitude scale is logarithmic, that still puts it maybe 20, 30 times smaller than the one that we saw in Boxing Day 2004. It did generate tsunamis, which were up to 3 meters high in places, but the length of fault that ruptured was much, much shorter, maybe 100, 200 kilometers, and therefore nowhere near as much energy was pumped into the ocean, if you like.
In the west, the second Sumatran earthquake has been largely forgotten, but on the island of Nias, which was close to the epicenter, 1,000 people were killed and hundreds of others were injured. Whole villages were leveled, and the Indonesian government had to send troops and helicopters to rescue survivors. After this second earthquake, countries surrounding the Indian Ocean breathed a sigh of relief. But scientists monitoring the Sumatra earthquake zone were even more worried.
If the earthquake is occurring along a join between two tectonic plates, a subduction zone in this case, which extends for thousands of kilometers, you may get several ruptures occurring in turn. It's like the subduction zone unzipping, if you like, bit by bit.
If another big earthquake is on the way, this island may tell scientists when. It's called Similu, and it's right on top of the fault line. The earthquakes lifted these corals an astounding 20 feet out of the water. For geologist Kerry See, Similu has become an earthquake laboratory.
Simalu is really extraordinary because you see, as you fly around or as you boat around, you see this brand new ribbon of dry, dead reef, this brown-white ribbon of coral reef. And beaches are now high and dry, and the waves are now breaking hundreds of meters further out. All of that happened on the order of 10 to 30 seconds.
Simalu does more than show the power of the earthquakes. It's an early warning station. Sea has measured the stresses in the fault line beneath the island, and they are still building up. Another earthquake seems inevitable.
We tell people now along the coast that they should expect that within the lives of their small children, there will be a giant earthquake.
There was little to report in April. May passed without serious incident. Record temperatures in June promised a long, hot summer. In July, all hell would be let loose. At the beginning of July, the first hurricanes hit the Florida coast, and they were early. Hurricanes Dennis and then Emily turned out to be record breakers, the strongest storms ever to form before August. For seasoned hurricane watchers like storm chaser Mike Tice, the early arrival of such powerful storms was ominous. A rough season almost certainly lay ahead.
My hurricane season started with Hurricane Dennis. I chased it up in the Florida Panhandle, and that was early July, and that's pretty rare for early July, and that was kind of a sign of things to come.
2005 would turn out to be the busiest year that any of the storm chasers had ever witnessed. It wasn't just the Atlantic that was brewing up. By the middle of July, freak weather was being reported from the other side of the world. In the Western Pacific, big tropical storms are called typhoons. On the 18th of July, Hai Tang, the first typhoon of the season, made landfall on the coast of Taiwan. Like Dennis in the Atlantic, Hai Tang was early, and its enormous power took the Taiwanese by surprise. As wind speeds reached above 150 miles per hour, it had to be reclassified as a super typhoon. As Hai Tang swept inland, it caused flash floods and landslides. Even though this was a super typhoon, the Taiwanese were well prepared, and there were only a few casualties. The early arrival of very powerful storms led to uneasy speculation about what was happening to the Earth's weather. According to some leading hazard experts, there was now plenty of evidence that the world is becoming a stormier place.
The last few years have seen very strong typhoon activity. In fact, it's seen very, very strong tropical cyclone activity across the world, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic and the Pacific basins. And in fact, research shows that if you go back over the last 30 or 40 years, that there's a general increase in stronger storms across the world, not just in the Atlantic.
In the same month of July, in the skies over the Bay of Bengal, something equally unusual was taking place. In this part of the world, the monsoon, which brings moist air from the Indian Ocean, is an annual and usually welcome event. Heavy monsoon rain usually comes at the end of June or early July. But in 2005, the monsoon was late. Instead of rain, there was drought, and the ground dried and hardened. When the monsoon finally arrived, the huge clouds were full to bursting. At the end of July, all that water was suddenly dumped on top of the island city of Mumbai.
In the case of the Bay of Bengal, the extreme flooding occurred as a result of incredible downpours over a 24-hour period. In a 24-hour period, they saw 1 metre, nearly 1 metre of water descending. That's enormous. It's unprecedented. That downpour not only was enormous, but it fell on dry, parched ground, which couldn't absorb the water. And so the water basically flowed into the cities and into the towns.
This was the worst downpour ever recorded in India, and it brought Mumbai to its knees. Water levels rose fast, and many were drowned in their cars. Dead animals and raw sewage led to an outbreak of disease. Hundreds were hospitalized. Landslides disrupted railways and killed more than 100 people. In the countryside, an entire harvest was lost. In 2 days, more than 400 people died. But it wasn't only nature that was at fault. Many victims were from the city's poorer areas. Here, homes were built over stormwater drains, and they took the full force of the floods. Just 2 days after the Mumbai floods, the Earth's weather sprang another surprise, and this time it was in a surprising place, the English Midlands.
You hear, oh my God! You hear that noise? Oh, there, you can see it. It's almost fire.
2005 was the year of the Birmingham tornado. On the morning of July the 28th, the Met Office, Britain's official weather forecaster, predicted thundery showers, no mention of a tornado.
We could indicate severe thunderstorm activity, but we're unlikely to predict tornadoes themselves.
But someone did suspect that something strange was brewing. Stuart Robinson is a weather fanatic and a member of Toro, the UK's tornado research organisation. His home is a mini Met Office.
Most mornings I check the weather maps to see what the day will bring.
That morning, as Robinson went over the meteorological data, he noticed a worrying
It
development.
looks like London, Heathrow's 24, south, in fact the whole of south central England is warming up now under the sun. I recall on the day of the Birmingham tornado, looking at the weather maps that morning, we could see that the situation has in fact become much worse, and that the chances of tornadic thunderstorms occurring were highly likely.
The Met Office had the same information, but only Toro took action. They issued a warning on their website.
As far as I'm aware, we're the only group who issued a weather warning for tornadoes on that day.
Although weather prediction even a few hours ahead is difficult, that day Toro had got it right. The residents of a Birmingham suburb were about to have their world turned upside down. On Ladypool Road, everything that happened would be recorded on this CCTV camera. It looks down on Uncle's home stores.
It was a pretty normal day, normal Thursday afternoon, just doing our bits and bobs around the shop, stocking the items out. It was a little bit dull. We had a bit of rain in the morning. We were told that, yes, it was going to be windy, quite blustery showers, but I think no one expected what we saw.
At 2:30 p.m, the weather took a sudden turn for the worse. Above the city, the clouds began to spin.
The clouds have started to move very erratically. It was like as if you've actually fast-forwarded a videotape.
Then the swirling vortex headed downwards towards the crowded streets below.
We have outside display, a couple of our items start to fly away. Our canopies have started to just fly up and down really, really strongly. You know, they start to rip.
I've started hearing what I thought was the window banging upstairs, and I went upstairs to shut the window.
At 2:40 p.m, the Birmingham tornado hit. Local residents captured images on mobile phones.
Oh my God! You hear that noise? Oh, there! You can see it! It's almost fire.
Looked over over a couple of houses and you could see a full-blown tornado. Loads of rubbish in the air, bits of trees. Just unbelievable. I've never seen nothing before like it in my life.
The eye of the storm headed northeast across the neighbourhood of Sparkbrook, following the line of Ladypool Road.
It was very wide. It was covering the span of the actual diameter, the span of it was covering buildings.
You could see a big black funnel, then just like a black cloud of debris.
I've just started seeing all the leaves off the trees in the park, literally just shredding off the branches.
Our first instinct was to start moving some of the gear away. Within the space of a couple of seconds, it was already at our doorstep. We left everything, just rushed inside. We tried to close the door, but it was just a case of me and my brother actually holding the door back as the tornado passed.
In a nearby park, the tornado caught a television news crew by surprise. The cameraman was knocked to the ground but kept on filming. He was only 100 metres from the vortex of the storm, and it was heading straight for Martin Jones in Birchwood Road.
I was stood in the stairwell at the top of the stairs. And then as I'm standing there, I just felt the wind rushing through the house, rushing past me, and just this feeling of fresh air, this being in the open, and just saw the roof being lifted from the house above me, just the ceiling going and just staring out, and just bits of debris flying everywhere, and slates and bits of masonry, and that's when I came downstairs after that.
And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the Birmingham tornado left the neighbourhood.
It was very warm. The sky was clear. Clouds were no longer to be seen. The birds started to chirp again. It was just very weird.
Just going out was just devastation. It was like, you wait for someone to say, cut. It's not a film, it was real.
Over the following days, Birmingham's ruined roofs were covered with blue tarpaulins. From the air, they showed clearly how the tornado had cut a swathe of destruction 500 yards wide and 7 miles long. As stunned Birmingham residents began to rebuild their homes, an expert flew in from America to make sense of it all. For Tim Marshall, tornadoes are a speciality.
What I do is hunt down tornadoes. I've seen over 175 tornadoes in the last 26 years.
Marshall's unrivaled knowledge of tornadoes, one of the deadliest forces of nature, comes from years spent in America's Tornado Alley. Here, tornadoes with winds up to 300 miles per hour can rip apart anything that lies in their path. These huge storms are formed when warm, moist air from the south collides with cold, dry air from the Rocky Mountains and are triggered by giant thunderstorms. Homes and even city blocks have been annihilated, and hundreds of lives are lost every year. The Birmingham tornado had been spawned in the same way as its American cousins. Warm air moving up from the south had collided with a cold front from the north, where thunderstorms were forming over Birmingham. These ingredients all came together, and the result was a swirling vortex of wind and rain. In Birmingham, Marshall would use the Fujita scale to assess the tornado. At the bottom of the scale, an F0 can smash chimneys and TV aerials, while a top-of-the-range F5 can rip entire buildings apart.
It's dark and we have rain wrapping around it. Very difficult to see exactly what's going on, so people need to just duck and stay low here.
On the streets of Birmingham, Marshall had to work like a detective, using the physical evidence the tornado left behind.
What I'm trying to figure out is how this car ended up in this position here. And what I see on the hood here is a line of bricks. And I believe that what happened is this car actually rolled across this wall and tumbled across into this position here, striking the wall in between. Well, knowing what the wind tunnel studies have shown on cars, I believe it takes about 100-mile-an-hour wind. And we know that Ladypool Road here was actually in the core of the tornado, winds out of the southeast, which is actually the strongest side of the tornado. There were several roofs off buildings, or cars moved, lots of trees down. Based on what I've seen here, the Birmingham tornado would be F2 on the Fujita scale.
An F2 is low on the scale, but in a British city, the tornado was unprecedented. In a matter of minutes, 1,000 houses were damaged, 112 roofs ripped off, and 90 cars smashed and mangled.
It was like a bomb had gone off. It was extreme amount of destruction, extreme amounts of destruction. And for no one to die in it, it was a miracle. It really was a miracle.
For Stuart Robinson, it was the frightening shape of things to come.
Tornadoes that are similar to the Birmingham tornado will occur again over the United Kingdom. One of those tornadoes will track across an urban area. It could be next month, it could be next year, it could be next decade, but it will happen again.
The tornado seemed yet another sign that Britain's weather was changing. Perhaps our green and pleasant land was becoming wetter and windier. But at the end of July, it would be our European neighbours who suffered even worse extremes. 2005 would be the hottest year on record. In Portugal, a heatwave followed by unrelenting drought set off huge forest fires. Hundreds of thousands of acres of forest and farmland were destroyed by out-of-control infernos. 15 people died. Forest fires have happened many times before in southern Europe, but this year, desperate firefighters and terrified local residents said they'd seen nothing like these enormous blazes in living memory. From high above the planet, satellites revealed the vast extent of the fires. They appear as glowing red beads scattered right across Portugal. As southern Europe burned, a very different kind of emergency was unfolding in the north. At the end of August, torrential rain fell over enormous areas of Central Europe. Floods ripped across huge areas of farmland and inundated towns and villages. Many thousands had to be rescued and evacuated. Road and rail transport was severely disrupted. There was widespread chaos. More than 40 people drowned. Like the fires in Portugal, summer flooding has happened before, but in 2005 it was unusually severe. Scientist Simon Boxall travelled to one of the worst-hit areas in Switzerland to investigate the roots of disaster.
The weather we're seeing in Europe is connected. The forest fires and the droughts in the south of Europe, in southern France, in Spain, in Portugal, and in parts of North Africa, are linked very closely to the very wet weather and the floods we've seen in northern Europe.
What happened this summer, according to Boxall, is that as temperatures rose to record levels in the south, wet air was driven north towards the Alps. Once this water-packed air had crossed the mountains, it fell as heavy rain into Switzerland's lakes.
The lakes in this region are huge, but as these lakes fill up, they overflow, and that water under gravity has to escape, and it escapes through the rivers.
That's a normal process. All lakes overflow into rivers. But in modern Europe, there's a problem. Many rivers have been re-engineered, and bends and meanders have been straightened. According to Boxall, instead of making rivers safer, it makes them lethal.
Bear in mind this water has incredible power. 1 inch of rainfall over a square kilometre has the equivalent energy of 3 Hiroshimas. And because they, if you like, straighten the river out for practical reasons in terms of development, in terms of preventing large floodplain areas occurring, that water is now moving much quicker. And this is really what causes the damage, the fact that we have this very fast-flowing water body.
One of the cities worst hit by the flooding was the Swiss capital Bern, which sits beside the River Aare. At the end of July, the river surged to a critical level, and floodwater rushed into the old city district of Matt.
For this little area, it was worse than ever before. I was working on that Monday morning and looked outside on the river and saw slowly there would be cars. And so you see the water's coming, and I just thought, oh well, people slowly should put their cars away. Then around 11 o'clock towards noon, they told me, you have to leave the house. Within 2 hours, it reached a height of 2 meters higher water, you know. So a lot of businesses were really badly damaged.
The floods took Bern completely by surprise. Swiss emergency services were stretched to the limit, rescuing stranded citizens. Floodwaters took another 2 weeks to recede. 4 months after the flood, Simon Boxall came to Bern to find out what had gone wrong. By now, the Swiss had efficiently tidied away most signs of the catastrophe that had overwhelmed their city. Only some discreet new plastering showed how high the water had reached. But for Boxall, the vital evidence was plain to see. A short distance upstream, the River Aare has been extensively straightened. So the summer's heavy rain turned the river into a battering ram. Like a tsunami, the torrent of water picked up trees and debris which blocked Bern's already overloaded water drainage systems.
Eventually the water has nowhere to escape to, and the only place it can escape is over the side of the banks. And that's why we saw the low-lying areas of the old city of Bern filling with water. Bern experienced the flooding as a result of two things: extreme rainfall over a long period of time, and poor planning and preparation for the rain that finally came and hit the city.
The chain of events that led to such severe European floods only began with heavy rain. The disaster that followed had as much to do with human management of rivers and cities as with nature. This pattern was to be repeated on a much more catastrophic scale on the other side of the Atlantic. At the same time that rivers burst their banks in Europe, a storm was brewing over the Atlantic Ocean. This one was destined to kill more than 1,200 Americans and wreck one of its oldest cities. For this tropical storm would become Hurricane Katrina.
All of a sudden, reality hits you of where you are and what's really happening to you.
By the summer, the year had seen the worst natural disaster for 500 years, record-breaking temperatures and freak weather in many parts of the world. Then in August came the most destructive storm in American history. On August the 24th, the National Hurricane Center in Florida scrambled its Hurricane Hunter aircraft. Their mission to fly into the heart of a powerful new storm that was building over the Bahamas. It was the 11th in a busy season and had been given the name Katrina. Like all tropical storms, Katrina was powered by the surface of the ocean. Warm, moist air is sucked high into the atmosphere, then sent speeding back down to create an immense whirlpool of supercharged wind and rain. To build a forensic profile of Katrina, the hurricane hunters carried a sophisticated armory of instruments and sensors. These sondes are dropped directly into the storm to measure wind speed and air pressure. The hunters approached their quarry at 41,000 feet. Cameras recorded what they saw. As they sped through Katrina's turbulent outer edges, the scientists were astonished to see that the huge storm had already formed a telltale eye, an immense 30-mile-wide funnel of ice and wind. As the streams of data were being fed back to supercomputers at the Hurricane Center in Florida, Katrina's wind speeds topped the critical limit of 74 miles per hour. So on August the 25th, she was promoted to hurricane status. Hours later, Katrina hit the Florida coast as a Category 1 hurricane. The storm chasers were there to greet her.
The eye wall is here. As you can see, the winds are very strong. The sand is blowing. This is getting really intense. It's blinding sand. You can't see anything. That's a bright one.
Across Florida, Katrina caused extensive flooding. But over land, she was deprived of the energy of the ocean and began to power down. But then Katrina crossed into the Gulf of Mexico and was back over the ocean. Ivor Van Heerden, America's leading hurricane expert, feared what would happen next. He knew that the warm waters of the Gulf would power Katrina up again and turn her into a monster.
Katrina then came into the Gulf of Mexico, where water temperatures have been record high, and it just grew very, very rapidly. I don't think we've ever seen a hurricane spin up so rapidly from a Category 1 to a Category 5.
A Category 5 hurricane has the equivalent power of 100 atomic bombs. Now Katrina headed straight towards the American Gulf Coast.
Look at that. The outer bands go all the way over. As far down as you can see, it's a little bright down there. But this is the outer bands it's coming through now. This is Katrina.
Storm chaser Mike Tice had raced from Florida to the Gulf to record Katrina's arrival. He was in the city of Gulfport as the hurricane moved in. Hurricanes pack a double punch. They bring severe winds, but their most deadly ingredient is water. 90% of hurricane deaths are drownings. What happens is that the hurricane presses down onto the surface of the ocean, forcing the water to rise like an unnaturally high and violent tide. It's called the storm surge.
It comes in swells. It's like it almost looks gentle, like these rolling kind of waves that come in. And then when that rolling wave comes in, then the next one builds on top of that, and it just keeps going higher and higher like that.
Tice was at a Gulfport motel when the storm surge hit. Waves more than 20 feet high rushed inland.
These walls are going to start coming in. This lady was in one of the first floor rooms, and I had alerted these Navy guys to it, and she would have passed away if we wouldn't have saved her, because she was trapped in her room already. She couldn't open the door because of the weight of the water.
Katrina started by trashing the hotel lobby.
Well, we're in the lobby here of our hotel. We're completely underwater in this first floor here. There's chairs floating by. The glass is broke. There's a car. We got a car that's getting ready to come right in the lobby now. We got a car in our lobby here. Doors are breaking. Watch the doors. We got things falling apart all around us now.
Katrina's storm surge was so powerful, it turned the storm chasers into the quarry. They had to find safety fast.
Here we are on the 4th floor here. The roof collapsed on this building below me. See, the roof broke off. The surge is dramatically risen here. This is just incredibly dramatic. This is Mother Nature at her worst right here. There was a Days Inn just a half a mile away that was a concrete structure, and it was completely demolished, just foundation, that's all that was left.
The scientists plotting Katrina's path had feared that she would score a direct and devastating hit on the city of New Orleans. But at the last minute, the eye of the storm veered to the east. Even so, there was no escaping Katrina's enormous power, for New Orleans turned out to be uniquely vulnerable. Sergeant Billy Gamillion was one of the first federal officers on the spot when Katrina struck. He knew the city and its weaknesses well.
New Orleans is entirely surrounded by water, and the city is 12 to 16 feet below sea level, depending upon where you are. So basically, New Orleans is a big bowl.
Running straight into the bowl is a ship canal. As Katrina swept past, it was turned into a storm surge superhighway, channeling water with missile-like speed into barriers called levees. They were supposed to protect the city.
Everybody believed those levees would hold. They broke, and that's why we had the flooding.
As the levees were breached, floodwater surged into the low-lying eastern districts of New Orleans. This is where Africa Brumfeld lived with her family. Their house was 12 feet below sea level, and for Africa, the collapse of the levees had swift and disastrous consequences.
Between midnight and 5, it was really bad. It was scary. It sounded like a train riding the roof of your house. Around 5 a.m., the electricity went off, and the house was shaking. It sounded like the walls were trying to just fall apart, and it was a scary feeling, and I started to feel like I was in a coffin. About an hour to 2 hours later, there was water, and it never stopped coming in, and it continued to rise, and it continued to rise, and I was thinking, if my house is 4 feet off the ground and the water is in my house, I'm only 5 feet 1. And it's in my house about 2 feet. There's no way that I'm getting outside without going for a nice swim. The water itself was black, so you couldn't even see through it when it was daylight. And when the sun started to rise a little at 6, it was still too dark to leave, so we had to stay in the house as the water is continuing to rise. Finally, when a little light came through, we grabbed air mattresses and pots because we needed something to paddle with. And we got in the water and we started to paddle on the air mattresses with the pots.
There were hundreds of other people facing the same predicament as Africa and her family. The bowl of New Orleans rapidly filled up. By the second day, 75% of the city was underwater and full of desperate survivors. Altogether, more than 1,300 people died, and hundreds of thousands were made homeless. The majority of them were poor and black. The American government was slow to respond to their plight.
we passed a lady in a hospital bed being pushed on the interstate. And all of a sudden, reality hits you of where you are and what's really happening to you. And this woman went to the hospital so that her life could be saved. And somehow she ended up on an interstate surrounded by a couple of thousand people being pushed with no medical attention anywhere.
After the first couple of days, we were calling this Lake New Orleans. There was water from here all the way that way to the Superdome, and then all the way to the Industrial Canal going east. And water here where I'm standing was over my head right here. It's a good place for a boat. But that'll show you how far the water got. I mean, this place is still devastated, you know? Look at the scum line. You can see on this truck right here and on these houses how high the water was down here.
Hey? Doing that show for Nova?
This house right here, there were 47 people in it when we pulled up. We got 47 people out of one house right here.
After the flood came fear, and the National Guard was called in. Now New Orleans really did look like a war zone. It could have been much worse, for New Orleans escaped the very worst of Katrina's power. The eye of the storm had headed to the east of the city, and that's where the hurricane would prove most destructive. Because a hurricane spins in a counterclockwise direction, its eastern side packs the biggest punch, like a boxer's right hook. Just after 6, on the morning of the 29th, the eastern edge of Katrina's 30-mile-wide eye made landfall in the little town of Waveland. Here, one of the untold stories of the hurricane began to unfold. Katrina was now at maximum power, and the storm surge reached an astonishing 28 feet, obliterating most buildings in its path.
Conditions would have been absolutely wild. You know, where we are here, there would have been horrendous waves, howling wind, rain, the surge, and then mixed up in all of this, lots and lots of debris. The debris piles up against houses, it helps knock them down, so it just becomes a self-feeding system, this destruction.
Eyewitnesses to Waveland's destruction were Lisa Monty and her family. They live a quarter of a mile from the sea and thought they knew hurricanes. But Katrina was beyond anything they'd ever experienced. She ripped through the whole house.
We were able to come out on this porch briefly. Even though the wind was still strong, we were sort of protected from the rain. And my sister-in-law was able to do a short videotape of the water that had raced down the street and all the debris as it came in. We saw all sorts of things just fly down the street in the water. And then we watched these houses shift and crumble. This is the head of Washington Street at the beach. There was a coffee shop over here and public boat launch and beach here. The old movie house was here. That was a store. That was totally destroyed, and along with everything, practically everything on this first block. But we were about 28 feet up here, so you could see how massive the wall of water was that climbed up.
And this represents the really destructive waves that pounded this area as we had a surge 20 feet above where I'm standing. So as we move towards this home, you'll notice that the building is completely missing and all this area is just gone. This home, a 2-story home, is missing completely. And if you want to find bits and pieces of it, you've got to go back almost half a mile to find the remnants. And if you look over at these trees here, you'll see that the bark is missing off those branches. And what that represents is debris that was in the surge moving past those trees and actually knocking the bark off them. This home was filled with furniture, heavy stuff like fridges, washing machines, stoves, all of that's gone. So as the surge moved through here, it picked up everything and destroyed it. There are other remnants. You can see here there must have been a closet in this area. Over there, a bathroom. Look at the tiles. But everything's gone. All the water pipes, for instance, just sheared off. So this gives you an idea of the destruction. This really looks like more like a site where we've had an atomic bomb go off.
After Katrina, the hurricanes kept on coming. Rita became the second Category 5 of the season and cut a swathe of destruction across Texas. The 2005 hurricane season was on its way to becoming a record breaker. As hurricanes battered the United States, forces deep beneath the surface of the Earth were about to unleash death and destruction in the Himalayas. Early on the morning of Saturday, the 8th of October, all over Kashmir in northern Pakistan, streets were busy, markets were opening, schools were filling up. It was the start of a normal day. Then at 10 to 9 local time, a giant fault in the Earth's crust slipped and violently shook the Earth. This mobile phone footage shows the moment the earthquake hit Islamabad, Pakistan's capital city. The world's third major earthquake of the year, it would eventually kill nearly 100,000 people.
I have at least 10 to 15 relatives missing. At least 10,000 people have died, maybe even 20,000 or 30,000.
50 miles from the earthquake epicenter, Islamabad got off lightly, but it was a different story close to the fault line. Maqsood Sheikh was at home in the city of Bagh when the earthquake struck.
I was there on the day when the earth shook. I felt that the room was shaking. I fell down on the ground, and then I heard a noise which I never heard in my life. It was like the noise was coming from the earth. The stones were flying all over. The dust was coming out from the earth. Everything was like falling down.
Two days after the earthquake, filmmaker Jeff Mackley arrived in Pakistan to document its impact. As he made his way north towards the earthquake epicenter, almost every house and business had been smashed to pieces. Roofs had collapsed, often killing entire families inside. The earthquake took place along the Neelam Valley in Kashmir. Here, many towns and villages were almost completely destroyed. One of the worst hit was Balakot. It was only 3 miles from the epicenter. In just 2 minutes on October the 8th, the violent shaking of the earth destroyed 80% of the town's buildings. The human cost was immense.
I met one woman a couple of days ago. She said to me that when the earthquake struck, she said the ground was shaking up and down violently and the buildings were bouncing up and down like the ground was made of foam rubber. It's really hard to imagine this much destruction happening in a matter of seconds. The magnitude of this disaster is so great, about 70% of the population are dead and buried in this rubble here.
इसमें वक्त लग गया इसमें
This is a frequent sight. People digging for corpses of their loved ones with their bare hands because there is no machinery available. It's going to take months. There are thousands and thousands of corpses buried under all of the buildings all over this town.
The terrible job of excavating the dead was taking place day after day in cities all along the fault line.
While I was working in the city, I was just running. I've seen the dead bodies, like I've seen the organs, like I've seen hands, cut off hands and legs, and once I saw a head, and I thought this is someone under the mud, but when I reached to the head, I've seen that it's just cut off head. I just cried there, and I pick up the head and I put it aside. Underneath every single building which fell down, there were cries of children and women or men, whoever. I can't explain. It's impossible to explain.
Balakot lies in the foothills of the Himalayas, a region with a long history of violent earthquakes. Here, two of the Earth's giant tectonic plates smash together. Put simply, India is shoving its way northwards against the rest of Asia. Where the plates collide, a gigantic fault line runs along the southern edge of the Himalayas. The Kashmir earthquake happened when a short section of the fault suddenly slipped. The earthquake measured 7.6 on the Richter scale. That means it was a major earthquake, but thousands of times weaker than the one that caused the Boxing Day tsunami. So how and why has this relatively modest earthquake caused such widespread destruction? And even more important, will the huge Himalayan fault slip again? And if so, when? To answer these questions, Roger Billam, an expert on Himalayan geology from the University of Colorado, headed for the stricken region.
Okay. So would you hold that and keep it upright? I've come to Pakistan to study this earthquake, which is quite unique. Although there have been lots of earthquakes in the Himalaya, this one is the first that's really, really hit us when we have a lot of instruments.
Four years ago, Billam set up a network of monitoring sites in the Himalayas. Each one had its own GPS device, which uses satellites to precisely record its position on the Earth's surface.
What we do is we measure the relative positions of these points to millimetre accuracy, and we return usually after a couple of years and remeasure those points to see how much the mountains are being squeezed. And what happens in an earthquake is that squeezing is suddenly released. Not 2 years of it, but 200 or 500 or 1,000 years of squeezing. And their remeasurement will tell us precisely what happened in the earthquake, not just on the surface, but down to depths of 10, 20 miles.
Billam's results revealed why a 7.6 earthquake was so destructive. Billions of tons of rock were thrown upwards more than 6 feet in just 3 seconds. So the earthquake's power was released very fast, and in a tightly focused area near the epicenter. That's why towns like Balakot were hit so hard.
So the town of Balakot lies right in the path of this rupture. The mountains to our left rose enormously in the earthquake. The mountain on the other side went down, and the accelerations were just too much for the buildings. They may have exceeded the force of gravity, which basically allows things to stay on the ground. Things were lifted up and flattened.
But the earthquake alone cannot explain the tragedy of Balakot. On October the 8th, the majority of its buildings collapsed with lethal results. Willem set out to discover why, and the clues were plain to see in the wreckage. Most buildings are concrete frames with a thick, heavy roof slab supported by square pillars. It was the way these pillars were made that killed the people of Balakot.
The cause of a lot of destruction is the weakness of these things. These are called stirrups. These hold the columns together. When you shake a building, these columns just explode unless these are strong enough. And you can see the steel is kind of wimpy for a structure like this. Very heavy roofs. Here's a roof that's just collapsed, pancaked down. You can see that must weigh a couple of tons, this roof sitting on the top of this column that's now bent in half. In fact, throughout this city, you can see the same story, of very weak steel, very weak concrete that's just not been able to withstand shaking for probably 20 seconds that went on here.
The most tragic consequences of these building techniques happened in schools like this one. According to UNICEF, children account for 1/3 of the deaths in Kashmir. Most of them were killed in classrooms. No provision had been made for earthquakes when these schools were built.
For 2 schools stood here. When the earthquake came, more than 800 school children were buried. Lessons were just starting, and when their parents scrabbled through the rubble, it was to heartbreaking results.
This was a 4-story building called the Sheed School. There were around 400 students inside when the roof collapsed. I took out 15 to 20 people. Some were dead and some were alive, but I could hear people's voices inside and we had no help.
4 days after the earthquake, the dead children's satchels and books were still lying in the ruined school, a temporary memorial to cruelly abbreviated lives. The devastation spread out from the earthquake epicenter for hundreds of miles. Many thousands of people had been made homeless and were on the move in search of shelter and food. Every one of these journeys in quake-devastated Pakistan was a battle for survival, fraught with danger. Along the fault line where the earthquake had struck, many bridges had collapsed as the earth jolted upwards. Everywhere there was gridlock, fear, and frustration. The harsh Himalayan winter was fast approaching, so it was essential to get clothing to as many of the survivors as possible. In the immediate aftermath, distribution was often chaotic. Many weeks after the earthquake, foreign governments, including the United States, finally began to provide aid and helicopters. Rescue workers were still trying to reach far-flung villages, and the only way was by air.
I'd like to see that too, but if you
As the helicopters started arriving, scientist Roger Bilham saw a chance to find out more about the deadly earthquake and whether another one was on the way.
This mountain range has a crack at its foot, right, halfway up.
One way to do this is to inspect the fault line itself, and the best way to do that is from a helicopter. Billam is hoping that the fault has broken through to the surface. If it is exposed, then it should provide information about the frequency of earthquakes in the region. That might allow scientists to work out whether another one is due, and at least roughly when. From above, the line of the rupture was clearly marked by a series of massive landslides. But it soon became clear that the fault itself remained hidden. It hadn't broken through to the surface. That was a disappointment, but taken all together, the information Billam had gathered in the course of his visit has disturbing implications. He's worked out that the October earthquake released only a fraction of the energy that has built up in the Himalayas over many centuries.
We know there are several earthquakes overdue along the Himalaya, and it's unfortunate that it's almost guaranteed that one of those earthquakes will produce an unprecedented death toll. There's probably 50 million people at risk from an earthquake any day along the Himalaya.
The implications are chilling. The October earthquake only lasted minutes, but the destruction spread out for hundreds of miles. By the end of the year, 100,000 people had died and 3 million were homeless. The humanitarian disaster the earthquake caused continues to unfold. At the end of 2005, the situation is worsening as the Himalayan winter bites. In the areas at risk, very few precautions are being taken to protect people from a new earthquake. Houses, schools, and other buildings remain death traps. All the evidence suggests that when another earthquake strikes, neither the world nor the region will be ready.
That little 7.6 was a gnat compared to the elephant that will be delivered eventually along that 2,000-mile stretch. And when that larger earthquake happens, there'll be somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of deaths, maybe 1 million people who die.
As the end of the year approached, the Earth was still a violent and turbulent place. Through November, hurricanes continued to pound the Gulf Coast. The 2005 season ended at last on December the 8th. It had started early, now it finished later than normal. And the season had been a record breaker, causing $100 billion worth of damage and killing nearly 3,000 people.
First of all, we had the earliest hurricanes on record. We had the earliest major hurricane on record. It was a record setter in terms of Katrina. We got that big one that we've been fearing for a number of years that would hit the central Gulf Coast, so hit Louisiana.
On the other side of the world, the coast that first felt the full force of the Boxing Day tsunami. This is Banda Aceh. A year ago, massive waves smashed into the city and laid waste much of the Aceh province. Jeff Mackley reported from here in the aftermath of the tsunami. He returned in December to find out what's happened in a year.
This is the main street of Banda Aceh, and as you can see, it's your typical Indonesian street scene. But it was very different this time a year ago, when these streets were choked with debris, mud, and dead bodies. So there's been a lot of cleaning up done in the last 11 months.
It's only the center of Banda Aceh that looks anything like normal. The tsunami destroyed a third of the city, and a year later, rebuilding seems to have had little impact. Till Boxing Day morning, this floating power station was moored in the port. The tsunami picked it up like a toy and hurled it inland 3 miles. So far, it's proved impossible to move. For survivors like Zulfadli Anwar, the ruins of his home contain bitter reminders of the tragedy that overwhelmed his family.
My sister and my brother and her couple children missing, gone with the tsunami, and nobody found their corpses. So around 40 people, member of my family, were gone also.
So everybody in your neighborhood are also dead?
Around 80% is dead.
All over the Aceh province, the tsunami swept away entire communities. In many places, there's simply no one left who can start rebuilding what was lost.
Back out in the areas close to the sea that were worst hit, it still looks like a war zone. Most of the people that occupied these houses are dead, pretty much all of them. So a lot of these areas here are just like a ghost city. There's no one left. There's a few houses popping up here and there amongst the ruins, but a lot of these ruins are just as they were left on the day it happened. They're just sitting here. That's the reality of it.
A year after the tsunami, nearly 500,000 people remain homeless. They're living with host families or in tents or government barracks. But even when they're rehoused, they'll still be living close to one of the most dangerous earthquake zones in the world. A tsunami could happen again at any time.
I think there's always the tendency for people to say, right, we're going to build properly this time, we're going to make sure that we're prepared so that we're not going to get caught again. But that very quickly wears off within a few years. That's the big problem, really. People are keen on preparedness immediately after one of these big events, but then other priorities come to the fore and gradually they forget.
At the end of this unprecedented year of disasters, are there any answers? Was it bad luck or a sign of worse to come? There are a few certainties. Next year's hurricane season is likely to be even worse. Oceans are getting warmer year by year, and they provide the fuel for hurricanes to form. Rising temperatures will lead to more extreme weather.
This is just the beginning. We're going to have more Katrinas.
So 2006 is likely to be hotter and stormier. For earthquake scientists, 2005 was simply a case of bad luck. Whether we get 3 major earthquakes or none at all is down to a geological lottery. Far more significant is where they happen.
It's only when you have an earthquake punching into a city that you hear about it. And I'm afraid we're going to hear more and more of these examples because there are so many cities now in the path of earthquakes.
The best answer may be it's not nature that's at fault, but the way we live, and above all, where.
The big issue really is more people in more dangerous locations.
Wind, flood, tsunami, earthquake. At the end of the day, we are a frail population living on a very robust Earth.
This century, I think, is going to end up being the century of the mega catastrophe, because we've just expanded into areas without much regard.
As we inhabit more and more of the planet, it's worth remembering it's not always the calm, safe place it might appear.